Okay, let's dive right in. We're talking about building modern Spring apps today, and specifically those annotations that make everything tick.
Exactly. They're fundamental, really. Instead of wading through tons of XML or config files, these little markers, they cut down so much boilerplate.
Right, so we're looking at a list, basically the top 10 Spring annotations you really ought to know.
That's the plan. Get the gist of what they do and, maybe more importantly, why they're so useful for, well, for your everyday coding.
Makes sense. Where do we start? The big one.
Yeah, let's kick off with @SpringBootApplication. You see it everywhere, usually on the main class of a boot project.
The one that just magically seems to start everything up. What's actually going on there?
Well, it's not quite magic, but it's close. It's a convenience annotation. It bundles three others you'd otherwise need: @configuration, @enable auto configuration, and @component scan.
Okay, break those down a bit. Auto configuration, component scan.
Sure, @enable auto configuration tells Spring Boot to, guess the configuration you might need based on the jars on your class path. @component scan tells it where to find your beans, your component services, etc. And @configuration means the class itself can define beans.
So at Spring Boot application is basically saying, okay, Spring, figure out the basics, find my stuff, and, oh, I might define some beans here too.
Pretty much. It bootstraps the whole application context for you. Huge time saver.
Definitely. Okay, so once it's scanning, what does it find? You mentioned components, like @component, @service, @repository, @controller. They seem similar.
They are, in that they all mark a class as a Spring-managed bean, something Spring creates and manages. But the difference is semantics. It's about the role the class plays.
Role.
@component is the generic one, the base. If nothing else fits, use @component.
Yeah.
@service is typically for your business logic layer. It doesn't add much behavior over @component, but it signals intent. Makes the code clearer for you and others.
Okay, readability. What about @repository? That one sounds data specific.
It is. It's for your data access objects, the classes that talk to the database. And this one does add behavior. It enables Spring's exception translation.
Ah, right. Exception translation. Remind us why that's useful for you.
Because database errors can be, well, messy. Different databases throw different exceptions. Spring's translation catches those low-level specific exceptions, like a SQL exception, and turns them into Spring's standard data access exception types.
So you write less error handling code.
Exactly. You code against a consistent exception hierarchy, regardless of the underlying database. Much cleaner.
Nice. And the last one, @controller.
That's for the web layer. In a traditional Spring MVC setup, it marks classes that handle incoming web requests.
Got it. So Spring finds these components. How does it connect them? If my service needs a repository, how does it get it?
That's where Autowired comes in. It's Spring's main mechanism for dependency injection. You put it on a constructor or maybe a field or a setter method.
And Spring just finds the right bean and plugs it in.
Yep. It wires everything together for you automatically. You just declare the dependency you need.
Much better than looking things up manually. Now, you mentioned @configuration was part of Spring Boot application. Can you use it on its own?
Oh, absolutely. Use @configuration on any class where you want to manually define beans. Maybe you need some complex setup, or you're using a third-party library that doesn't have Spring annotations.
And inside that, a configuration class, you use @bean.
Precisely. You put @bean on a method within a @configuration class. Whatever object that method returns, Spring registers it as a bean in the application context.
Like defining a custom REST template or something?
That's a classic example, yeah. If you need to customize how it works, you define it with an @bean method.
Okay. @configuration for the class. @bean for the methods inside creating the beans. Clear. Let's switch to web stuff. How do you link a URL to a specific method in your code?
That's @RequestMapping. And it's more specific versions like @getMapping, @postmapping, @putmapping, and @deleteMapping. They map HTTP requests for a certain path and method, like a get to users, to one of your controller methods.
Simple enough. What if part of the URL is data, like users 123 to get user 123?
For that, you use @PathVariable. You mark the parameter in your method with @PathVariable E, for instance, and Spring extracts the 123 from the path users and passes it to your method.
And for query parameters, like users.statusActive.
That's @RequestParam. So @RequestParams status would grab the active value for you. Very handy for extracting input.
Path variables for IDs, RequestParams for filters.
I got it.
What about RestController? Seems like everyone uses that for APIs now.
Yeah, it's super common. A RestController is another convenience annotation. It's basically @controller plus @response body rolled into one.
And that response body does what again?
It tells Spring that the return value of your method shouldn't be resolved to a view name, like in traditional MVC. Instead, it should be serialized directly into the response body, usually as JSON or XML.
Ah, so at RestController is just a shortcut for building APIs that return data directly. Makes perfect sense.
Exactly. Less boilerplate for you when building RESTful services.
How about getting configuration values, like from a properties file?
For that, you use @value. You annotate a field with that value or something similar, and Spring injects the value from your application.properties or environment variables when the bean is created. Keeps your configs separate from your code.
Essential stuff. Okay, one last core one. Managing database transactions. That can get tricky.
It can, but Spring makes it much easier with @transactional. You just put this annotation on a service method, typically one that modifies data.
And Spring handles the begin, commit, rollback.
That's the gist of it, yeah. It wraps the method call in a transaction. If the method finishes successfully, it commits. If an unchecked exception flies out, it rolls back. Declarative transaction management.
Like the classic money transfer example, debit and credit have to happen together or not at all.
Exactly that. @transactional ensures that atomicity for you without lots of manual transaction code.
Wow, okay. We've covered a lot of ground there. At SpringBootApplication, the component types, at Autowired, at configuration, at Bean, the web mapping annotations, at RestController, at value, at transactional. That's quite the toolkit.
It really is. And understanding them is, I think, crucial for being productive with Spring.
Absolutely. It makes reading and writing Spring code so much faster for you. And listen, if you found this kind of focused breakdown useful, really digging into these core technical pieces, you might want to check out the I'm Tech channel. They often do deep dives like this into essential concepts. Subscribing could be really beneficial.
Definitely. These annotations are, in a way, the language you use to tell Spring how your application fits together. Very powerful shortcuts.